just to let you know, this is quite a serious and a sensitive issue for somebody coming from Germany right now. And I ask for your understanding, because many of the people who are speaking up critically on right-wing populist parties are now targeted in social media. Bishops are targeted. Bishops and pastors receive personal threats. Myself, if being put in the media, I could also receive threats. So it's also a bit of a matter of how to report on this. Murder threats have been issued against people who speak up against nationalistic movements in Germany. You might know that in the regional parliaments in Germany, the representation of populist parties like AfD, that is Alternative für Deutschland, is double the size as it is in the federal parliament. In the federal parliament you have around 12% members of national parliament now representing right-wing populist parties and movements and very much blocking the parliamentary process, whereas in the regional parliaments, and we recently had elections both in Saxony and also in Thuringia, you have 27 or 23%, and that means half of the electorates, for instance, in Thuringia, are dominated by right-wing populist parties. That is quite a serious threat, also for the inner unity. Just to reveal one little thing for you, I don't know whether you're following press. In the Church of Saxony, just a couple of days ago, the presiding bishop had to resign because it was found out that some 10 or 15 years ago, he himself had unfortunately published kind of early writings in a right-wing nationalist newspaper and was then severely accused of not having revealed this and critically commented in the way in which he was elected to become bishop. So this is an indication for the fact that how to struggle and to be in dialogue, in critical dialogue with right-wing populism, affects also the internal dialogue and the internal affairs of the churches now very strongly. It is a very sensitive issue. What I would like to present to you after some first general introductory remarks, a bit of the characteristic marks of right-wing populist movements in Germany. I would like to refer to some biblical theological approaches which can help us in understand the task of the churches. I have some references to similar situations of churches facing periods of polarization, but we might have to skip this due to reasons of time. I want to introduce you to some pastoral and prophetic approaches of churches, particularly in the context I come from, which respond to social and political movements of populist ideologies in Germany, and I like to end with certain conclusions. Now, there is a growing range of publications and research papers around on polarization in Germany, which has become a major issue now in the public debate. For instance, there is research that is on the left side. I apologize, this is in German because originally this is a German presentation made to partner bishops of the German Protestant Church 2 weeks ago. Konrad Adenauer Foundation had published a research paper on growing polarization in society, arguing that 44% of our population still holds a positive view on the future of Germany, but if you look to the constituency of both the far right and the far left, it is 80% of those voting for right-wing populist parties which hold a very negative view on the future of Germany, and it is more than 60% in those voting for left-wing parties like Die Linke in Germany. So it's a very clear indication that the major umbrella theme which you have selected in the CEC conference, Have Hope, Not Fear, refers to the core of it, because what is at stake and what is circulating in the whole of society is kind of an anxiety, is an ideology of fear, is propaganda using the fear of people. So fear is very much at the heart of this different kinds of fears. And it's not just that polarization is between left and right, as indicated in this article by Spiegel, but it is also between those who are more liberal, those who are conservative. Sometimes it is between those who are in favor of understanding anthropogenic climate change, those who argue against. So it is across the political lines that you have different moments of polarization now in society. And I have noted with great admiration and confirmation that in October in Malaga in Spain you have brought together a major consultation on populism and human rights. And this predominantly negative messages of being against, this is also very much marking the populist discourse in our own context. So how to counter ideologies of fear comes down to a key question for churches in Germany as well as in Europe. There is a think tank which I would like to bring to you from Sweden, and they have done a research on authoritarian populism across Europe, which you see on the right, on the left side here, and you also have a panorama of the percentages of populist, right-wing populist parties in Europe. This is from 2017. Some have changed, and some have argued, well, is it that the zenith or the climax of right-wing populist movements is over already? But I think there is other evidence showing from research that the climax of right-wing populist movements in Europe is probably not yet reached. Part of this also due to the ongoing Brexit dilemma, which strengthens and reinforces populist trends of anti-institutionalism, anti-European trends and motives also in other Europeans. So the lingering on of this Brexit huge dilemma, as I see it from German perspectives, is also serving as a reinforcement of right-wing populist trends and movements in our own context. Now, it's very interesting to also realize that the right-wing populism in Europe nowadays also is fueled by a resistance against anthropogenic climate change analysis. So that we have a polarization in society between those who are more favorable in reading the IPCC reports and to take them seriously, and those who follow the line of the administration of Trump, who negates and is kind of moving close to climate change denials. And one of the head of the right-wing populist party in Germany, called Gauland, has now stated the Greens are the ones ruining Germany. The Greens want to ban the combustion engine, want to end coal mining. That's why we have to fight against the Greens. That is the main goal. So it's very interesting that some parts of the right-wing movements are now violently attacking the environmental movement and the Green Party, and also many Christians who have been engaged for environmental concern and care for creation. There is a number of internal articles in Germany, and many of the local dioceses questions how to encounter populist movements have come up very strongly. Roman Catholic annual reception in Berlin just very recently was dealing also with issues of populism in society. So the dialogue and the wrestling with issues of right-wing populism has become a major theme for both the Roman Catholic as well as the Protestant and some of the Orthodox churches in Germany. Now a question comes up certainly, how do we exactly understand the relation between church, polarization and society? Because it makes a difference whether we primarily look into political polarization, whether it is economic polarization, ethnic or social polarization, cultural, religious or also education-related polarization. Many of these factors, so the question always comes up, how are the churches dealing with issues which have the potential to create polarization or reinforce polarization in society? A first working definition might read like follows: national Populism is a political ideology which combines right-wing politics and populist rhetoric and themes. The rhetoric often consists of anti-elitist sentiments, opposition to the perceived establishment, speaking to the common people in brackets, while both right-wing populism and left-wing populism object to what they see as the capturing of liberal democracies by elites. Populism of the left also objects to the power of large corporations and their allies, while populism of the right normally focuses its attention on immigration. I would say the situation in Europe certainly looks different in different countries. The situation, for instance, of the previous government in Greece looks completely different than with our current party situation in Germany. But left-wing populism in Germany does not play a major role. It is right-wing populism which makes the game and which is very much in the press and in the media as such. It is striking for me, and I recently have been in this city. You know, 2014, a German city called Dresden was the major starting and kick-off point of the right-wing populist movements, which at that time were called Pegida, and this title reads in German language Patriotische Europäer gegen die Islamisierung des Abendlandes. It's almost, well, it's not forgotten in German debates, but it is patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident. So it is also very disturbing for many churches that they were carrying an illuminated cross, and a cross which has the colors of German patriotism, of the gold, red, and the yellow color, and they were claiming Christian symbols for the defense of their ideological line. So it is very interesting that some parts of this Dresden movement then spread in the whole of Eastern Germany, and it was now 1 week ago, and that was after I finished this one, but I draw your attention to this. Our National Synod, which is the EKD Synod, just met in Dresden. It is in the city where the right-wing populist movement started. And it is in the city of Dresden where just 3 or 4 days ago they came up with a solid public declaration of the churches to become a church of just peace. And that is a very interesting declaration for you. I would have loved I could bring written copies of it, but I'm sure that there will be also English translations of it. So look in the internet and you find the Dresden EKD Synod Declaration oder Kundgebung in deutscher Sprache, which I think is a contribution to the subject you are dealing with, because it is an indication how the German churches on the national level deal with a context of growing social polarization while becoming a just peace church. So one could argue, and that might be the key message I want to convey to you at this point, that the German Protestant churches try to keep together the pastoral approach in the ministry of the church and the prophetic approach in the ministry of the church. To keep both dimensions together is very important for the church to counter such movements like this. The second element of right-wing populist movements in our context is also then a very much harsh and aggressive propaganda against the church, because the church is presented as a left, liberal, externally controlled and forced into line by the state. So they are using a German term which is translated into Gleichschaltung in German language. Gleichschaltung, you know, was the key term which was used to describe the situation of German Protestant churches during the fascist period, during the Nazi period. And they argue that the German Protestant churches nowadays is in the same sense of captivity over against the dominating elite in society, and so they're completely reversed, because it's out of it's absurd to argue like this, but it has become a major part of the right-wing populist agenda. And just, you know, the history of the German Kirchentag, like last one happened in Dortmund, and just 1 week prior to the Dortmund Kirchentag, 120 Christians, 20,000 Christians attending, they published this leaflet which is on the left side, Unheilige Allianz, der Pakt der evangelischen Kirche mit dem Zeitgeist und den Mächtigen, accusing Protestant churches to fall prey to what they call the substitutional religion of climate mitigation or climate adaptation. So they accuse the churches of perverting the gospel into some kind of climate religion. It's very bad propaganda, and we have found out that none of those who have written this statement, which presents itself as a theological statement, is any ordained theologian of any church. So it is written by labels, but presents itself as a theological attack on the churches. It's not easy to be credible witnesses of Christ in a context like this, where you have huge propaganda. I need to move on quickly. Okay. The certain concept of people, a narrowed concept of people, which presents people as an ethnically homogeneous concept, and is always put over against the others. May they be racially different, culturally different. So homogeneous concept of the people is at the core. Then also the fight against the elite, which is viewed as a corrupt entity or as betrayers, and a very negative perception of all other religions, and predominantly a very negative projection of Islam is one crucial element. And we have realized that the hostility or hostile attitudes over against Muslims is the stronger the fewer they have any encounter with any living Muslim. Because in those regions where they have almost no representation and percentage of Muslim citizens, the hostility over against Muslims is strongest. So it is the lack of interfaith and real faith interfaith encounter which leads also to these negative perceptions over against other religions. And this also certainly refers to a very negative perception of media, both the publicly funded media as well as the private media channels, because this is always presented as being under huge influence from interest groups. And very often this is not in the slides, but it's also combined with an undercurrent of strong anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitic elements are still there in corners of Germany. They are not often come to the public because that is even legally not allowed. But for many of those who belong to these movements, anti-Semitism as well as xenophobism in general form proper elements. Now I want to make a clear distinction that right-wing populism and right-wing extremism are not the same. And we have to distinguish them also from conservatism. Right-wing extremism is different from right-wing populism, as it resorts also to violent means of political and strategic struggle. And that is an increasing phenomenon which is worrying for us, because in the milieu of right-wing populist movements, some secret networks of right-wing extremists which resort to violence have emerged. They are supervised by the intelligence service in Germany, but it's very difficult to get hold of them. And they have done murderous attacks against citizens. A leading Christian politician from Kassel was brutally murdered by right-wing extremists. Other politicians quite recently have been facing death threats. So the issue is now very, very intense. And that should not be mingled up with conservatism. A large percentage also of church membership is in the line of more conservative citizens, holding to strong family values, defending the role of the state, the rule of law, what we as churches also defend very strongly. And that should not be confused with right-wing populism. well, I skipped this. What can be the root causes of increasing right-wing populism in Germany? One, but not the only issue, is the growing income and wealth inequality which we have in Germany. You see from this graph that 11% of the population, we put together the dark blue and the lighter blue sector here for Germany, owns 65% of the capital assets. The social and economic inequality in the context of a rich country like Germany is increasing dramatically. You see that in many of the urban settings, the Gini coefficient is increasing. That is an indicator for the social inequality, which we have here as well. Studies also from the OECD indicate that in Western societies we have something what is called a broken social elevator. That means the ability of people from the lower sector of society to move upwards and to have social upward mobility, to move up the social ladder, is broken, is increasingly stopped. People are arguing that in a country like Germany, you see Germany in the back column on the right side before Argentina, it takes 6 generations for those born in low-income families to approach and move into the social sector, which has kind of the average income in society. And if you look where you find your own country, at least this is a very serious indicator that the emergence of right-wing populism and the lack of cohesion in society, that the political center is weakened and that the extremes both on the side and on the right and on the left are getting increased, that this has to do also with growing economic equality. But I think it is not just social inequality and economic equality, but there are also cultural, political factors involved, like that the reunification of Germany after '89 had used more a top-down approach than a bottom-up approach, and many of the people in Eastern Germany have not felt being fully made participants of this process of reunification is an issue. And also very much what we realize now, the destruction or the destructuring of rural spaces, rural areas in societies. That, you know, first pharmacy closed, second school is closed, then public bus stop is fading out, no taxis, no jobs anymore. So there is a disempowering and a destructuring of rural spaces which is taking place in lots of regions in Germany nowadays due to the urbanization and the lack of strategic attention to the rural spaces. And that fuels right-wing populism, because people have the feeling they are left behind and nobody cares for them. So we have to seriously look into this. What are key theological approaches we can relate to? Well, I want to remind us that we have these 4 essential marks or essential dimensions of what it means to be the church, which are embedded in our creedal traditions: the unity, Catholicity, apostolicity, holiness or sanctity. How to relate the pastoral mandates of the church, and that is both referring to unity and apostolicity. We are sent to all people and we want to keep the people together in one church. How does the pastoral mandates of the church relate to the prophetic mandates of the church? And that has to do with the holiness or the sanctity of the church. We have the call also to be in non-conformity with some of the values and standards of society, and also the Catholicity or the ecumenical nature of the church. That is at work in some of the key items which I want to remind us. The ancient society in the Mediterranean region was not at all a homogeneous setting at all. We see from the letter of Corinth to the Corinthians that the apostles have struggled from its early beginning with disunity with plurality, with ethnic migration, with diversity. So it is not in vain that the Apostle Paul has called the churches to be steadfast as ambassadors of reconciliation. How to be ambassadors of reconciliation in a context where society tears apart, where there are gulfs between people and people cannot talk to each other. How to maintain dialogue in situations where it does not seem to be possible by any rate. That is what we can learn from Taizé community, that is what we can learn from San Egidio community, that is what we can learn from various important ambassadors of peace and reconciliation in global Christianity. The second major calling, we have as churches the calling to stand up for the truth of the gospel and at the same time for the unity of the church, not one at the expense of the other. And the third one, as churches, we are always a community of those who are different. I refer to Ephesians 2, this key clause of inclusivity: you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of His household. The churches have an ancient competence in dealing with cultural and ethnic diversity. And that is what we have to bring into our societies. That we are not a nationalized religion, although that is a strong topic, I know, also for several of the European churches, but we have a competence and a long history of cultivating a reconciled sense of ethnic and cultural diversity within our own constituency. That is something which we have to bring into society. But also biblical tradition tells us that there are results sometimes from authentically preaching and living the gospel, as wonderfully explained in the famous story in Acts, where a healing took place and hostility and enmity is the result in terms of the population. So the preaching and the acting of the church sometimes also creates conflicts, because if we are clear in terms of our standards and the core elements of the gospel, we can also create conflicts, and we should not be too worried about it. And we have also this warning in the New Testament tradition that we have the task of a permanent discernment of the spirits and critically distancing ourselves from false prophets. There is a long clause in Luke 21 and also in other places, and so we have to exercise some kind of ministry also of what we can call apologetics. So we have the pastoral task of the church, we have the prophetic task of the church, but we also have the apologetic task of the church. Discerning the spirits in our contemporary time is part, and we have to warn people also with regard to false prophets. And the last element which I want to bring into consideration here, that the New Testament tradition is aware of the fact that even in the earliest periods there have been cases in which a visible separation is demanded from people, from movements, from representatives which violate essential principles of God's love and justice. And these are reported in the 1 Corinthians chapter 5, or also in the third letter of John. So we have this, what in later development also in canon law has led to something called excommunicatio, which has its own problematic history, but there is an element in it which is very important. There are areas, there are situations where the churches have to also articulate a clear border and clear red lines and limits. And at the same time, the churches also always had this tradition of restating community and re-accepting members into their own koinonia once they renounce their destructive attitudes of behaviors in cases they represent and transform. So there is also an issue of church discipline and of conciliar fraternal dialogue with sisters and brothers in ministry, which I think is important for us. I will have to skip this. some closing remarks. So I skip all the interesting documents which you can read at a later stage, because there are lots of very interesting documents. But we have to make a distinction between those politicians which propagate these ideologies and those faithful who fell prey to them. And therefore we as churches should never refuse any dialogue where genuine concerns, fears and anxieties of people are expressed or could come to the forefront, which are not really listened to. Because we as churches have the obligation to leave no one behind. And I think that is a learning lesson we have to exercise again in much of our social context, not to leave anybody behind. We have also the need to develop an improved culture of a genuine dispute, instead of withdrawing only into social and political milieus of like-mindedness. Some colleagues have called this, we need to multiply courageous conversations. I like this term. Courageous conversations are conversations with those who are not on our side. Those who would never come to our office and speak with us. Those whom we would be even criticized in being in dialogue with. Those where we risk the reputation of ourselves to be in dialogue with. Too often, even church representatives talk only to like-minded people. But we as churches, we have the task to listen to those who are on the other side. What are those topics, what are those themes where an official ecumenical body has the right and the obligation to declare a courageous conversation to take place? Very hot topics which are normally not dealt with in public. So this is something which I would like to give to you. We fourthly have always to search for what can be formulated and felt in common, what unites people, what brings reconciliation, what strengthens social cohesion in villages, cities and regions. Because we are realizing that right-wing populism is a serious threat to the very functioning of democracy. So some speak of the recession of democracy in Europe. And these courageous dialogues and the search for what can be formulated in common and what unites people, what creates cohesion in society, is also a rescuing mission for democracy in Europe, because it is seriously endangered. EKD has published a major study on democracy. I can also give this to you later. We also need to make every effort to enlarge and to transform the perception of Islam and of people of different religious traditions. As often the negative views are the stronger, the less a real encounter with people of other living faith actually takes place. 6th point, positive narratives of migration. So often the term and reality of migration is only perceived and narrated as a negative story, a negative, a narrative of threat, of conquest. But we have positive narratives of migration. Many of them are embedded even in the history of Christian churches, and you have referred to the reality of migration churches all around in Europe, which gives living witness for the gospel and for the positive results of migration. These stories need to be shared, also in the media and also in church reporting. Then we need to contribute to the strengthening of the lost center, political center of European societies, as this political center seems to be rapidly disappearing. And lastly, we need to take part in developing and creating a new language of common development, of shared and participatory reconstruction of an ecological civilization which safeguards the rights of future generations. Joint ecumenical work on the Laudato Si is crucial also for answering the threats of right-wing populism. That is what I wanted to share with you. It is a bit abbreviated right now. I ask for your understanding, but a lot of more materials are available. And I refer to, again, the final declaration of Dresden Synod, our National Synod, just a couple of days ago. And last but not least, as the President of CEC, Christian Krieger, has mentioned that the assembly of WCC is going to come. Why not considering on the side of CEC, or might be also joined by CCEE, to work out a proposal for a major declaration on nationalistic populism, democracy and the role of churches for the WC Assembly? How is this topic going to come to the Assembly of WCC? That is the question I want to raise. Because, you know, one of the most famous ecumenical conferences was the Oxford Conference of Church, Community and State in 1934. And if you read into the reports of this famous assembly, which was working without laptops and but only with mechanical typewriters, but still they achieved a lot. Fascinating church documents on right-wing populism and nationalism. If you read these documents from Oxford Conference, you will be astonished and you have the feeling this is the language which is needed for today. But where is the international ecumenical movement preparing for coming up with a strong, solid Christian statement on nationalistic populism, democracy and the role of churches for the future? That is, I think, what would be demanded by many churches.
And polarization in Europe, made by Professor Dietrich Werner. I'm going to just sort of try and underline what we can do in church, as church. What as church this affects us, and what we can do as churches in Europe. I have to thank very much at the beginning and for the prayer at the beginning of this meeting we just had. I was very moved by it. A very nice prayer, both for the text of the Galatians 2, and also you remind me very much when you talked about that incurvatus in se, that expression of Luther. So important to understand what it means to be in a sin. Huh? So thank you very much for the prayer. So in English, I think what is important to start with is to summarize a bit what Professor Werner said about the main characteristics of populism. We have to understand what it is so as to face it. He spoke about saving the Christian Occident, using sometimes Christian symbols. There's something common to populist movements. It's this idea of saving the Christian Occident. Another element that we find, fighting against the institutional church, which is viewed as liberal. So you find attacks against the church. Then another feature of populism that was described, it is based on a certain conceptualization of the people. The people. And the people are seen as in conflict with the elites, which is seen as corrupt or as betrayers. Populism also in Europe, populist movements express fear of Islam or of Islamization of Europe. This is becoming quite frequent, this sort of expression. And it criticizes social media and the corporations behind them as producer of fake news. The causes of populism that Professor Werner spoke about, I think it's useful to remind ourselves of them. The feeling of people in society being left behind, not fully integrated, cut off from relevant social and political developments. The experience of economic decline, discrimination, exclusion, social and economic inequality, and the broken social elevator we saw. So we have some causes. The feeling also, another of the causes, the feeling of losing one's own cultural or ethnic identity. It's getting a bit diffused in this global world. We see this. And migration. Migration, it was said, is not a cause, but it is also involved in this phenomenon of the rise of populism. So these are possible causes or factors that are involved. In summary, I would say, and this is going a bit forward of what Professor Werner said in his very nice speech, I think the main feature of populism is this distinction between the pure people, the common people, and the others, those above. The populist leaders claim to represent the will of the people that is not represented by other political parties. Once in power, and we've seen this in some countries, they try to weaken parliament, the freedom of media, the opposition, the courts, and civil society as a whole. Another feature, another characteristic of populism. It can be based on different ideologies: nationalism, anti-establishment, anti-immigration, anti-Islam, anti-Semitism, anti-globalism. And on religious matters, populism follows a dual strategy. It appeals to religious sentiment and tradition. We saw that cross in that slide as a sign of identity. It also wants to limit religious freedom. It gives, and this is something said frequently, it gives simplistic answers to complex issues. It appeals to sentiment rather than to reason, to fear and hate. As we have seen, it finds fertile soil where to grow in economic and social distress and in lack of social mobility. But most of all, I think, one of the important features for us is that populism is based on an oversimplistic concept of identity, distinguishing us from they. So, for example, you can hear people saying, I cannot be Polish and European at the same time. So this concept of identity, I think, is very important. And then is this whole thing about migration. I think Professor in his speech said very well, migration movements are often not the direct or main cause for the political swing to the right, but only an enforcing and accompanying factor which is utilized for ideological welfare. But migration is there. Migration is also there. And if you allow me, I would add another factor that for me is important as a psychologist. It has to do with fear. Because I think socio-economic, cultural, and specific regional processes involved in the rise of populism have also a deeper cause. And I think a person that made this cause, expressed this cause very well in a speech he gave in Paris in 1997 on intolerance was Umberto Eco. I'm going to read a small paragraph of his, because I think this is very important to understand another part of the phenomenon of populism. Eco talks about a wild intolerance, una intolleranza selvaggia, he says, that has a biological origin. It is the fear of the other, of the unknown, that we also find in animals when they defend the territory, and in children in their emotional reactions to something that they are not familiar with. This wild intolerance exists before any doctrine is formulated and is impermeable to criticism. The only way to confront it is education. I quote this text of Umberto Eco in Italian. Now maybe summarize it, but you have the translation. Very short. He says the following: Eppure lì sta la sfida. Educare la tolleranza agli adulti che si sparano addosso per ragioni etniche è tempo perso. Troppo tardi. Dunque l'intolleranza selvaggia si batte alle radici, attraverso un'educazione costante che inizi dalla più tenera età. prima che sia stata scritta in un libro e prima che diventi crosta comportamentale troppo spessa e dura. So, in other words, this wild intolerance, questa intolleranza selvaggia, at the roots of populism, this intolerance that is deeply also rooted in us, that can come to expression in times of distress and fear, when confronted with something other that we perceive as a threat, and that is used and amplified by populist movements, can only be fought by education that has to start at early stages of childhood. So, what are the consequences of populism that worry our churches? I will say these, and we can add some more, but to be brief, I'll say three. The dehumanization and stigmatization of minorities, migrants, refugees, religious minorities, poor people. So this is one of the consequences of populism that worries us. Second, that our religious symbols and traditions are used, or better misused, by populist leaders and movements, as we have seen. In the Catholic context, sometimes this happens taking a clear stance against the Pope's teaching and criticizing him for his speeches on migrants or protection of the environment. So use of religious symbols and sometimes attacking the Pope. And the third, what worries, I think, us very much is that also members of our churches can think, feel, and act in a populist way. It's not something external to the churches. It's something that is also present inside the churches, as we see in our parishes. In Spain, for example, a good proportion of the votes of this party Vox, I think you've heard about it, 15% of the votes in the last elections, 52 MPs out of 350, the third political party now in Spain. Considered by many a populist party, there's been some doubt on this, but it's considered by many a populist party. Many of the voters of Vox are Catholics. Mainly these votes come from people that are unhappy with the popular party for its way to treat issues related to gender equality and family. Something similar we know happens in Poland with PIS and the Synod platform. Podemos in Spain, that is another political party that is considered by some also a populist party, gets plenty of votes from people sincerely worried for the poor and for migrants, some of them Catholic, though much less, due to the history of Spain that we know, and a strong separation between right and left wings, a right wing that normally has been closer to the church, and a left that has been normally anti-clerical. Catholics in Spain tend to vote for right-wing parties. So, as churches, what can we do? Briefly, in the long term, the only cure to populism is good education. As we have seen, and also Umberto Eco mentioned in that paragraph I read. And education is a mission of our churches. In our schools, and when we have access to public education. So education, I think, is the remedy. On a psychological level, to overcome that natural fear for what is unknown, the best way is to encounter it and get familiarized with it and experiencing that nothing bad happens. That is why organizing meetings, encounters, intercultural and interreligious activities help very much to vaccinate people against populism. This was said before. You see a greater rise in feelings against Muslims where there are few Muslims. So interchange, connections, getting to know what is different, what is other, is a way to overcome psychological field. Together with this, in the short term, I think it is important to be very careful about the way we preach, and to put in the center of our preaching topics like mercy, like openness to the other, inclusion, fundamental equality of every human being in front of God, in the terms of it said in the presentation on the biblical theological approach. So we have to care our way of preaching. I think a very important concept that might help us in this is this concept of human fraternity, of this document signed by the Pope and the Grand Imam of Al-Assad in Abu Dhabi. And it's a very interesting concept I think that can overcome a lot of tension and create community also with the other. So first, to take care about how we teach, the things we teach and the things we preach. A second point I think is important for the churches is to react with determination against stereotypes when we hear them and when something inadequate is said of others. And I think this is very important for us leaders. When we hear a critique of another community, when we hear in our community stereotypes being used against Muslims, we have to react. You have to react. I think this is very important. And this is very important for leaders. And this happens in our communities. I've been a parish priest for 20 years, and sometimes in my parish I heard, because Spain is also a very polarized society, I heard critiques of Muslims. Like all Muslims were trying to conquer Spain again. Huh? And things like that. So I think we have to react with strength when we see inadequate expressions of the other people. Then, using our media to defend human rights and avoid stereotypes and hate speech. Because it might seem strange, but sometimes in our media, in our church media, sometimes we use this kind of inadequate language. We have to be careful with this. Then, another thing we can do, action and witness. Helping migrants and minorities, nearness to those that are targeted by populists. So, this attitude of solidarity, of nearness to the people that are targeted by populist movements. And then the last thing I wanted to say that we might do and might help is organizing frequently occasions for intercultural and interreligious exchange.
Do offer some reflections on populism and theology, and you will inevitably hear some recurring themes that have already been mentioned. But I have also tried to focus particularly on offering some theological insights that tie in, I suppose, both with my own personal experience and story, but also with the situation in the Church of England and from an Anglican perspective. So I hope that that'll offer some different insights as well. And it's somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes, I think, my contribution. So I live in a fairly sedate village in rural Leicestershire, which is pretty much right in the middle of England. And yet 2 of my neighbouring MPs, both women, have in the last year seen members of the public jailed for making death threats against them. And of course, the murder of the MP Jo Cox still casts a very heavy shadow over much public campaigning. So what resources, theological and spiritual, do we have in a climate such as this, where populist language in a political system leads to increased abusive language and indeed aggressive behaviour in public life more generally? First, I want to suggest that we need to listen to and recognise the voices of the marginalised, even when those voices cause us discomfort. You will remember, I'm sure, Bill Clinton's famous campaign line, It's the economy, stupid. Well, one of the most important lessons we in the Church of England have learned from the Brexit referendum is that it is in fact not always the economy that people care most about. Of course, a flourishing economy is necessary if civilized life is to flourish. But a profoundly unequal economy destroys many things that people value. We have had 40 years in which communities and culture have been seen as serving economic growth and been eroded as a result. Now the imperative is for the economy to be put back in its proper place as the servant of culture and communities. It is a fundamental Christian insight that the great truth about being human is not our autonomy, as the market theorists insist. Rather, it is our dependency on others, which in the end is itself the incarnational outworking of our final dependency on God. Populism in the UK, or perhaps more accurately, I should say, in England and possibly Wales, but populism is one way in which communities and cultures who have felt unheard and left behind are pushing back against the subordination of human neighbourliness to the imperatives of the economy. And this isn't easy to hear. So one form of populism is the reaction of downtrodden people against those who have set the terms of their existence. If our theological commitment to responding to the voices of the poor means anything at all, we must be alert to these voices and not dismiss them if they fail to use the vocabulary and conceptual frameworks that we happen to prefer. In the UK, Brexit has shown us that people have often been given no language to speak about the dislocation they feel when sharing space with large numbers of people who embody different cultures. Instead of acknowledging that sense of dislocation, they have been branded as racist, a knee-jerk slur from the kind of liberals for whom multiculturalism offers more promise than threat. There is a theological theme underlying these issues, which comes, I think, from the literature of exile. This is a rich theme for me personally because of my own story and journey, one of dislocation and exile from the place of my birth in Iran. So perhaps the discomfort for me and those like me who hold so firmly to the welcome of the stranger is that the presence of people who are in geographical exile from their own lands have become the embodiment of an inarticulate sense of exile among those who feel their own country has abandoned their values, even though they have not moved an inch. That is a very complex challenge to us. We need to reflect, I think, on the story of Naboth's vineyard and what it tells us about people's attachment to place rather than to the market value of land. And we need to understand that exile isn't always geographical, and nor perhaps are there hierarchies of exile for people who are displaced in different ways. Whilst recognising the importance of all of this, my second point is about challenging populism, which abuses and dispossesses others. Having recognised populism as one way in which the cry of the displaced seeks to be heard, we need to be very much on our guard against a second form of populism, the populism that seeks to mobilise the anger of the dispossessed against a third party. This involves the fabrication of a mutual enemy so that the power of the people is deployed not against those who oppress them, but against a convenient scapegoat. And Europe has too many examples of this kind of populism in its history for it to need much introduction. And that is one reason why challenging this kind of populism is so very difficult today. So let's look instead to our Christian inheritance for some inspiration. It's tempting to turn to the prophetic literature, to the voices who spoke truth to power in God's name. But there is, I want to suggest, something a little self-aggrandizing, perhaps, in comparing ourselves to Isaiah or Hosea. Surely the most important scriptural and indeed theological reference as we face manipulative populism orchestrated by the powerful is the cross. When communities and those who are powerless are being scapegoated, Jesus was there first. Scourged and rejected by a people whipped into fury against him by the powerful and elite of his day as a way of appeasing the global power of Rome. When asked to articulate and own the identity of the scapegoat, the pretender to Jewish kingship, Jesus replied, "You say that I am." As the scapegoats of populism are being made to carry crosses not of their making, we need to be very clear about naming those who are today's Pilates and Herods, who attribute to them their hated identity. As the migrant is accused of being the source of the problems in British society, we might hear their voices echoing with Christ's own words, "You say that I am." Narratives created by those in power, notwithstanding that they have been taken up by the poor and disadvantaged, must still constantly and continually be challenged. In the final section of my paper, I want to suggest one theological task and one pastoral imperative, both of which the Anglican tradition may, in common with others, have something particular to contribute to. First, the theological task of resisting binaries. As I've suggested, populism is not one thing, and we need to be careful to distinguish what is going on and avoid getting caught in simplistic binary analysis. The referendum in the UK forced us to decide between binary choices. The impulse to know our identity and belong on the one hand, reflected in the vote to leave and emphasise our national British identity, versus on the other hand, our impulse to recognise that we are part of something bigger and that we need each other, reflected in the vote to remain. For me, the breadth of the Anglican tradition means that we strive to negotiate the complexity of grey areas that exist between polar opposites. Rather than submitting to black and white binaries, we struggle to hold together the many paradoxes of faith, church tradition, and pastoral practice in the midst of what is often complex and messy and incredibly painful. Resisting the binaries, I want to suggest, is our Anglican gift to the world, albeit one which we often struggle to live by ourselves. Secondly, the pastoral imperative of building resistance. So how shall we create the conditions where scapegoating populism can be resisted? I suspect it won't go away quickly, so we need to build resilience to resist. And what better place to turn to for inspiration than the example of the early church? I don't want to talk up persecution narrative. My own faith has been shaped by having grown up in the persecuted church in the Middle East, and I know and understand something of the reality of suffering for one's faith. However, I'm deeply uncomfortable with what has become, paradoxically, the motif of some Christian groups in Europe who are themselves fomenting scapegoat populism, not only against liberal societies, but against Muslims and other Christians. But we know that the earliest church of the Acts of the Apostles met together. Physical proximity strengthened their mutuality and enabled them to endure in Christ. Whatever the uses of social media and today's ultra-connectedness, it has undoubtedly become a vehicle for populism. And the idea that it can easily be turned towards truth may well be optimistic. In the end, the face-to-face is what allows us to encounter Christ in one another. So our congregations become places where simply by meeting and breaking bread, we become subversives. And that is not about meeting just with people like ourselves. The Anglican parochial tradition is sometimes under great challenge through strategies of building homogeneous communities. But at its heart, the Anglican parish is, or at least should be, a place of belonging for all within its borders, regardless of creed or faith or religion or culture or tradition. And every part of the land, every part of England is covered by this provision of a place of welcome. By opening our doors, well, not in fact our doors, but the doors of which we are merely the gatekeepers, but by opening these doors to the stranger and recognizing that in Christ our brothers and sisters will often look nothing like us and sound nothing like us, we subvert scapegoating. And by recognizing that no church knows all there is to know about Christ, we maintain the importance of the local, of community and of culture alongside a proper relativism. Each local church needs the bigger vision of the worldwide church of Christ, if it is to be authentic and not to mistake its own face for the face of Jesus. That is one of the reasons why the work of Keck and gatherings such as this with CCEE are so very important. And yet we are supremely, perhaps, local and global at once. And it is that which may enable Christian churches to avoid the binary and instead help people regain their sense of community and identity without allowing that identity to be exclusive. We must respond to the erosion of community which has prepared the ground for today's populism, whilst holding fast to our universal vision of God's kingdom. In this interim between Pentecost and the Parousia, we have to hold together the local, which is where people can be their best despite their limitations, and the global, which is the ultimate mission field, the ultimate meaning of God's kingdom. So in conclusion, the rise of populism with its abusive language and its exclusion and scapegoating of others has become an unavoidable part of the political and social discourse within the United Kingdom. Whilst we cannot challenge what we do not understand, the depths of our theological and spiritual resources, not least some of, if I may call it, the genius of Anglican theological method and pastoral praxis, offers us a way to draw alongside, both with challenge and also with care. Thank you.